Mathy Stanislaus, Esquire, serves as the Vice Provost and Executive Director of the Environmental Collaboratory, TEC, where his commitment is dedicated to nurturing climate and environmentally just solutions. At TEC, the flagship program revolves around advancing co-led climate justice solutions led by community leaders. Nominated by President Obama, Mathy served 8 years as the Senate-confirmed Assistant Administrator for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Land and Emergency Management. During his tenure, he spearheaded the nation's first climate emergency preparedness plan, addressing the consequences of more intense, frequent storms and rising sea levels. As a co-chair of President Obama's Chemical Plant Safety Task, he facilitated consultations across the country to establish regulations addressing the impacts on fenceline communities from frequent chemical plant accidents exacerbated by climate-fueled extreme weather. Led T Repowering America's Land Initiative to foster renewable energy development on current and formerly contaminated lands, landfills, and mine sites. Before joining Drexel, Mathy led the establishment of a multi-stakeholder platform at the World Economic Forum to address child labor, forced labor, and the procurement of critical materials necessary to advance the scale-up of batteries and EV and renewable energy. Prior to this, Mathy was a founding co-director of the New Partners for Community Revitalization in New York, an organization dedicated to technical assistance to communities of color and low-income communities for community-led redevelopment. He was also a long-term member of the board of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance.
Thank you all. I hope everyone is enjoying your this presentation. So just give, I know these questions came up earlier regarding how exactly can we address energy justice, how do we make sure that climate environmental justice is meaningful for the most burdened communities. I want to give a little bit of a snapshot of what is entailed. So this is a map. If you all are familiar with the White House CJUST map, a climate environmental justice map, what we did was we mapped the neighborhoods looking at multiple hazards in a real granular way, looking at things like percent of populations of color, below poverty, renters, various health indices, health disparities, as well as environmental issues like air pollution burdens, proximity to hazardous and contaminated sites, looking at heat issues, heat indices, and urban heat island kind of questions, looking at flooding zones. So it gives you a sense of those neighborhoods with the highest of these burdens. So when we talk about climate environmental justice, what we're focusing on, what I always talk about, is we have to begin all solutions with these communities and go inward out and not outward in. The history of environmental programs, environmental regulation, most of environmental advocacy has tended to be a support for all of society first, with the hope that the most vulnerable communities would benefit. But this intention trying to flip that model and really focus investments, resources, and policy in these neighborhoods. In terms of energy burden, what we've done is we've mapped the neighborhoods more specifically around a number of categories, focusing on kind of energy burdens and the consequence of energy burden. So we looked at things like accessibility to affordable energy. We look at the presence of heat and the health of those neighborhoods. So looking at not only the environmental and socioeconomic concerns, but what are the challenges of paying your energy bills? These are becoming even more crucial. We not only have concerns from low-income residents of being shut off from during the heating season, but now we have the need to make sure there's no shutoffs during the cooling season, and then figuring out how we can kind of address broadly their deep concerns about energy affordability. So this gives you a little bit of the demographics of the neighborhoods that we're talking about. So, we see the percent of populations below the poverty line, the number of populations that do not have a high school degree, levels of unemployment, and also kind of the racial and age breakup of those communities. And this is give you a more blow up of the percentage of the population. So in these communities, what this provides a overview of the multiple of stressors of these neighborhoods, from energy burdens, but also some of the issues around things like lead paint homes, which creates huge lead poisoning questions and a number of other environmental concerns. So this is kind of the existing circumstance of the most vulnerable neighborhoods from these multiple of stressors. So now you add on to that, there was a question earlier around the impact on climate. So this is a snapshot of the impacts of climate change in these, and broadly for Pennsylvania, but what you can see, and I've highlighted the heat graph, what it really shows is that heat is one of the top extreme consequences of climate change. And if you look at the various sub bars, the implication of that, of that health, of the heat waves is human health issues and issues of impacts to the most vulnerable. So we have to look at, well, we have these pre-existing concerns of these lowest income neighborhoods, affordability of energy. How do we actually address that, but also look at how do we help them do the transition to clean energy? So that's, in effect, how do you address the question, what does climate justice, environmental justice mean on the ground? So we at Drexel had worked with a number of community-based organizations to address that question. So we began with kind of the longer standing questions around better education, around basic things of like weatherization, basic ways of kind of reducing the need for heating or cooling. And based on our analysis, we think we can decrease the energy burden by 5%. So that directly means reducing the total cost outlay for the most vulnerable community. So number two is, frankly, the biggest challenge right now. Frankly, while there's lots of effort, the Biden administration has made a major commitment to not only through the Inflation Reduction Act to foster the adoption of clean energy technologies, but also through a focused attention to things like Justice 40, which you heard earlier, to benefit the disadvantaged communities by at least 40%. But there are still kind of challenges in that. So the efforts, like how can we make these lowest income neighborhoods, the energy burden neighborhoods, being able to take advantage of things like solar energy, heat pumps, low cost cooling. While we think the tax credits for that and rebates for things like electric appliances are a great thing. One of the big challenges is a lot of the residents have to front cash. So one of the big challenges that we're working on is how do we enable a bridge kind of financing to enable the low-income residents to be able to take advantage of these kinds of clean energy technologies. Related with that, there's also a need to retrofit their homes, and these homes are very old, have significant structural questions. So you can't think of these clean energy technology alone. We have to think about the built environment. I know Tony is going to be talking about that next workshop, but so enabling the energy transition is both make sure the home is as protected as possible, as a living place, and that enables the availability of these clean energy technologies. And again, I want to underscore from a policy perspective, we have to look at policy around around the affordability question, not just the availability question. So government is when it's good, it makes these tools available, but in many cases, there is a gap in affordability. So to enable this transition, we have to meet communities where they are, and the most vulnerable communities, we have to figure out their financing question, figuring out their current home conditions, and how do we help retrofit that? That's the only way that we're going to enable these most vulnerable communities to both reduce their energy burden and enable clean energy technology at the same time. Another effort is making sure that residents from these communities can participate in these opportunities, can install heat pumps and solar and other kinds of areas. So while it's great for the degrees that the participants of this, we also want to make sure that residents from the neighborhoods who may not want to pursue a four-year degree, or at least not now, have an opportunity to participate in the clean energy field. So we are working with a number of job training programs to look at how do we train returning citizens, how do we train disabled veterans, how do we train single moms who may only have a GED. So we really want to create a broader spectrum of job opportunities. President Biden has made a major emphasis that a lot of these jobs do not require a four-year degree. So we want to train them up. And at Drexel, we're trying to figure out what are the supplemental skills that are necessary. And we want to bring some of our expertise, things like how do you make AI accessible, virtual reality, those kind of tools in the clean energy training and implementation areas. And I kind of broadly talk about a kind of energy democracy. So the fact is that so much of policymaking, particularly in the clean energy fields, are very resistant to community engagement. So one of the things that really drive affordability is the rates that utility commissions set. And so the way that rates are set are very much set through an insider process where you have the public commissions, public utility commissions in Philadelphia, and then you have public service commissions in other jurisdictions. It tends to be a very technical process. But at the end of the day, without having communities, particularly both the residents and advocates for the residents, talk about affordability questions, talk about the nexus of energy and homes, we will not have effective energy policies. So one of the things we're really focusing in on is energy democracy. And the most direct issues that we're trying to deal with is how do we prevent utility shutoffs? And then once we can prevent that, how do we enable the tools, financing and education to have residents understand the benefits of, electric appliances and heat pumps, both short and long term. So I will close with some of the results through one of our partners, Energy Coordinating Agency. So they restored heat of 3,000 families where the utilities had shut off their availability of energy. They've through installation of things like heat pumps, they were able to avoid close to 42,000 metric tons of carbon emissions. weatherized 800 homes, trained 250 workers. So I'll close with these are things that we can work on the ground. We have a long way to go. I mean, the current structure of energy delivery, energy policy, as well as environmental policy, is not really tailored around the communities and residents that I was referring to. So I will stop sharing and look forward to your questions.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's give a round of applause for that presentation. Thank you. I just launched your post survey, so the attendees are engaged in that right now. And then when you're done, please do raise your hand or put questions in the Q&A for engagement. All right, I see one question. Oh, that hand went down. So in the Q&A, Rija says, thank you for the insight. I believe community-led decision-making can also help, especially to target funding for underserved areas to address energy inequities equitably.
Yeah, agreed. And we are working on, I mean, the way that we approach is all of our work is co-led and co-funded. And we are working with a number of community-based organizations to access some of the Inflation Reduction Act resources from the Justice for the resources. You're absolutely right. Part of why policies have failed is because policymakers design policies in government offices. And we want to really kind of flip that model where we empower communities to bring community knowledge and bring community advocates. Because what community organizations always tell us is, you know, what they have done is built up trust with their residents and local elected officials. And they must be empowered to be able to translate the on the ground needs, gaps, and priorities to policymaking. So there's nothing else you take out of this is really important about empowering communities and building their capacity to participate in the solution building.
Any other questions? Here you go. So Taziana, thank you for sharing more about this topic. How would it look to have community members join a webinar like this? What are other ways and other scenarios we can bring lower income neighbors to the table? Great question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great, and we've done some webinars, but in terms of community resident education, you know, we strongly believe in doing workshops in the communities itself. And so we partner with the community-based organizations like ECA that I've mentioned. And we also need to make sure the information is accessible and understandable to community residents. So it's very much going to where communities are, listening to them, listen to their issues, and then linking that with education about opportunities.
Any other questions or comments or engagement from content earlier in the webinar either?
Yeah, maybe I'll address maybe Mariah's question in terms of what was the general consensus from communities. And I would say like we did a community workshop just 2 months ago, and I think the general consensus that communities feel like they're being passed around when they get asked, when they're asking you know, agencies and commissions uh, and and the feeling that the agency is not there for problem solving, they are being passed on from one to the other. I mean, they also feel that the structure of engagement is not designed around their limited time to be able to participate in government decision making.
David Howard asks, how can architecture students and professionals better align with initiatives in environmental justice to design spaces that support health equity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, so I would start with, the fundamental tenet of justice is power building, right? So the most important thing that we could do is build power and empower communities. And once we do that, then help communities and community-based organizations to understand what their priorities. And you're going to be going through the workshops in terms of, how do you design or redesign a low-income resident home for clean energy opportunities, for heat pumps, but also how do you look at the financing? So I think understanding community, and engaging communities where they are, understanding their built environment. Again, so many of the homes are very old, sometimes are very porous, and need a retrofitting. So I think as an architectural student, I'm trying to understand the condition that they're living in, so you could design around the circumstance as it is, not just kind of this academic exercise, assuming that all buildings are the same.